Thank you very much for that introduction. Danse kakio, haumatakiape, danse kiawao. Just greet you all in a few of the Indigenous languages from Treaty 6 here. What an amazing ceremony we just witnessed. I just, as someone who's a ceremonial person too, I just want to acknowledge what we just witnessed and the meaningful words and heartfelt words that were shared. And it makes me feel a lot more comfortable and kind of open sharing what I have to share with everybody today. So hats off to those strong Indigenous women, those Wîcêhtowin who helped to put all that together. Really, I have a lot of respect. And yeah, really happy to see the direction that NFU has been taking and moving in. So with that, I only have limited time, and I know we're running maybe a little behind, so I'll try to go through things as quickly as I can. So the title of my presentation today is Miyo wîcêhtowin, Indigenous Peoples, Food, and Climate Adaptation. So just a few things to go over in 20 minutes here. Yeah, so I'm really grateful for the NFU making space for the presentation, and a big hats off and thank you to Kathy for connecting with me and inviting me to come and share a little bit today. The presentation I split into three parts. The first part's going to relate to Indigenous peoples' experience of food through colonization. The second part is going to highlight a couple of sort of Indigenous revitalization, resilience activities around food that are being pursued by local nations within Saskatchewan here. And then I'll talk about a couple of climate adaptations related to food that are also happening. And I look forward to the Q&A. I've heard you're a lively group, and I've felt the good energy already, so look forward to some good discussion toward the end here. So the next slide, am I doing the slides, or is someone? Is this it? Thank you very much. Okay, a little about me. I mean, he just read my bio, so you know a lot about me, but very diverse ancestry, diverse cultural experiences. I spent about 7 or 8 years teaching and traveling internationally. It was really, powerful experience for me, and some diverse professional experience as well. You see my ancestry up there: Norwegian, Chinese, and Métis. And I always try to acknowledge and honor all of my ancestors. I wouldn't be here without them, obviously. But having grown up in Treaty 6 territory and spent time with Métis Indigenous people, that's the part of my identity that's really come to the fore for me. I actually identify as a Pitagosan, which is a Cree word for a Métis person who practices more First Nations ways. So it also says on the slide there that I'm a ceremonial helper. So I've been helping with the Lakota ceremonial leader for almost 20 years now, and I've been able to connect with a lot of different elders and knowledge keepers from all over Turtle Island, and I'm really grateful for all that I've learned. Oh, there we go. And yeah, hopefully I can share some of that with you today. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of my background, kind of what I've been through, where I'm coming from as I address some of these issues. So Indigenous peoples and food through colonization. I think most of us have heard about loss of land, culture, access to different things that Indigenous people have endured through colonization. But for me, at least, I haven't heard quite as many discussions around food and the impact or experience of colonization through the lens of food. So I wanted to address that today because I think it's really important. And I guess, too, I want to just highlight the intergeneral impacts of the things I'm going to be talking about. Because, we sometimes hear people say, well, that happened so long ago, just get over it, kind of thing. But the things we're going to talk about have impacted people and families, created cycles of dysfunction that are really difficult to break, especially when you live in a society that doesn't always view you as an equal human being. So even though I'm very, fair-skinned, white presenting, I can pass as white very easily. My dad never went to residential schools, but he was brought up in an orphanage and foster homes, and he endured a lot, and it's impacted our family and me as well. So I've heard it said, and I believe that there isn't probably an Indigenous person alive who hasn't been impacted by intergenerational trauma. So just want to preface things with that. So one of the first things I want to talk about is just the change in diet that occurred with the establishment of the reserve system and the Indian Act that confined people and prevented them from pursuing their traditional lifestyles. So I think all of us might be able to imagine what would happen if you shifted from a diet that consisted of actively working the land to harvest your food, protein, nutrient-rich wild meats, greens, berries, nuts, and being out on the land pursuing these things daily. When the first explorers, missionaries came to this part of the world, they were amazed at the health and the condition of the people and how healthy they were. And I think a big part of it is because of the diet, you know, and the activity, the lifestyle that people led. And shifting from that to being confined to a reserve, not being able to pursue your traditional practices, and being forced to survive on rations provided through treaty that were predominantly refined white sugar, white flour, and lard. You know, bannoc's really yummy. I love bannock, but it's not going to make for real healthy people. There's not a lot of nutrients in there. And some people consider bannock a traditional food, and you know, I hear that a lot, but amongst some of the people who work in this area of kind of Indigenous peoples and food, it's characterized more as a survival food. It's something people were ingenious enough to create to keep them alive. And again, I still love bannock, but again, it's not healthy. It's not something that's going to contribute to overall health and well-being. So the introduction of these rations, these nutrient-poor foods on Indigenous people had really dire impacts, and I managed to do a little bit of research and learn about some of that. So associated with the introduction of these foods was tooth decay, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, obesity. And it's not that none of these were around before. It's just the scale, I guess, the way that the prevalence of these now. And Indigenous people, unfortunately, you know, we're overrepresented in a lot of these categories when you look at health statistics. So it's still something that's impacting people today. And then globally too, there's been research done. Obviously, Canada is not the only place that's been colonized, but there's been research done around the world that's documented these changes in diet. And they've actually documented changes to people's dental structure, changes to people's facial structure, their height. This is how severe the impact of that change in diet was on people. And it kind of pains me to say that because, you know, I work with a lot of Indigenous people. I am Indigenous myself, and, you know, how do we come back from that? But one of the ways we do that is start to feed ourselves better, start to eat more nutritious food, start to go back to our traditional diets, make the most of the new foods that have been brought here. And some of that work is starting to happen, and I'm going to share a little bit about that in a moment. Another important thing to consider with Indigenous peoples and food is money, and I think that's something we're all feeling these days. Gas is getting more expensive, food is getting more expensive, and when you are from an oppressed population who is still recovering from ongoing cycles of trauma, you know, that's even a bigger challenge. And those economic disparities too are strongly influenced by federal policies and practices. So the Indian Act, for example, controlled, you know, how the kind of implements, first of all, that people were given to farm with. Obviously, a lot of Indigenous nations were put on substandard or subpar lands as well, kept the best lands for the settler farmers. They were given, substandard implements to actually do their farming with. Their crops that they could grow, where the sale of their crops was controlled, the price at which they could sell them was controlled. So there wasn't really, you know, a level playing field. And then there's practices as well, and I don't call this one policies, but you might have heard of the pass system that controlled the Indian agent, kind of controlled life on the reserve. And if you wanted to leave the reserve, you had to have a pass from the Indian agent. And if you didn't have one, you could be arrested, fined, thrown in jail, those kinds of things. And that pass system wasn't even legal. There was no policy, there was no law ever passed that allowed that to happen. That was just something that people started doing. There's actually a documentary that was made about that. So, and I guess in today's world too, like a lot of our Indigenous people living on reserves where access to healthy whole foods is challenging. You often need a vehicle, gas money, a driver's license, which aren't things that everybody in reserves have. So we're often forced to buy the highly processed, high sugar foods that are cheap at the local reserve store. And in the urban areas too, I think we all know about the food desert here in Saskatoon. If you live in the urban area and you don't have access to a vehicle or money for an Uber or a taxi, you're buying your lunch from 7-Eleven or something like that. So these are still real issues today as well. I haven't been paying attention to time and I get kind of wrapped up in this, so I'll try to hurry it along, but these first few slides are a little bit on the heavy side, and this next one I think is probably the heaviest of them all. So we also need to talk, we're going to talk about Indigenous peoples and food. We need to talk about the history of malnutrition and starvation that Indigenous people were subjected to. So first of all, there's the issue of inadequate foods served in residential schools. There's actually one of the citations down there is Bryce from 1922. He was a federal official who tried to raise the alarm of what was happening in residential schools, and unfortunately that fell on deaf ears. But back in 1909, he even wrote another paper to the federal government where he estimated that 25 to 50% of young people in residential schools died because of maltreatment, because of racially motivated harm. So on all of this, I think too, we need to understand that all of this took place in a context where before all of this even happened, the estimates are that up to 90% of the population of Indigenous people in North America was wiped out by smallpox and other infectious diseases. And you can imagine in your own family or in your circle, if 9 out of 10 people you know disappeared, what that would be like. And for Indigenous people who are oral people, you know, we didn't write things down, we didn't have computers, we didn't have Google to look everything up. So you can think about the knowledge loss when you lose 9 out of 10 people in your community. So it's just another contextual piece that I wanted to bring to the fore here. Starvation was also used as a manipulation tactic to try to get people to move off of lands that were desired by settler populations, as documented in James Dashuk's book, Clearing the Plains. And then the last piece in here too is the nutrition and starvation experiments that were performed on Indigenous children that I don't think a lot of people know about or maybe have heard about, and it only came to light in the last maybe 10 or 15 years. But from 1942 to 1952, so for 10 years, there were 6 residential schools where this was happening. And this was done, you know, with the green light from the federal government. Many children died there. They were taken without, you know, knowledge of their parents, without any consent of any kind, as you can imagine. And during this time too, the Nuremberg Code was passed after World War II, you know, kind of giving a legal precedent of how we're to treat one another, but that didn't stop what was happening in these schools. You know, that was just ignored. So, you know, Indigenous people had been, and unfortunately, and there still is an element around today, I don't think we can be ignorant about that, where Indigenous people are seen as less than human. Things are changing, and obviously what's happening here today at this organization is amazing and is a beautiful, beautiful thing. But those elements are still present in our societies, unfortunately. Okay, so we'll shift gears a little bit. We're done with the heavy parts now, and we'll get back a little bit into the revitalization and resilience piece. And when it comes to resilience, you know, Indigenous people have been through a lot. The fact that we're still here, still willing to share and talk and partner, to me is just an amazing thing, and just comments on the spirit and the nature of Indigenous people. Okay, we'll get into it here. I'm just going to share 2 examples for the sake of time. There's a lot of things that are happening, and there's 2 First Nations communities in Saskatchewan that I'm going to focus on. One is Mistawasis Nêhiyawak, where I was employed as an Indigenous food sovereignty specialist and helped them get their food sovereignty program off the ground. And the other one is the neighboring reserve of Muskeg Lake, and these 2 reserves are about an hour and a half north of us. So in my time at Mistawasis, we actually were pursuing Bill C-92, which is a federal piece of legislation that allows First Nations to gain control over their own child and family services operations, given the sort of dire care that's been given to Indigenous children through the federal and provincial systems. And as part of that, we were talking about how do we support these families. A lot of CFS work is, when it's done by the province, is really done just taking kids away from families, but there's not much done to support the families. And so we wanted to actually support the families, and one of the ways we thought we could do that was to create a food sovereignty program and try to solve some of that access. And so if you're a traumatized person trying to heal, going through these cycles of dysfunction in your family. If you don't have access to good nutrition, those challenges are just made that much more difficult, right? So good food isn't going to solve the problem by itself, but it's going to help. It's going to help. And so we did that. We pursued that, and in a short time, within, I think, about 2.5 years, we got a greenhouse facility going. We have a demo aquaponics, so growing fish and plants together. Had that created. We had created some community gardens. We take band members wild harvesting, cooking and food preservation classes as well. Some of the vegetables we grew people weren't familiar with, so we had to provide some assistance there, which was great. We're also preparing to bring back buffalo and bison, which I'll talk about more in a moment. Food forest, and then the foods that we produced were supporting the school lunch program, and served our elders, and then also our child and family services program. And I could talk a lot more about that work, but again, for the sake of time, I want to keep moving forward. At our neighboring community of Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, there were concerns raised by their band members that intensive agricultural practices and climate change have been altering the landscape and changing the accessibility of certain plants and foods. And as somebody who does a lot of land-based harvesting, I've certainly noticed that as well through climate change. I used to have really beautiful Saskatoon berry patches. The last 2 years, I've seen like maybe 3 berries just because of, I think mainly because of drought. So with those concerns, they got some funding through Canadian Feed the Children and created a 2.5-acre food forest in 2018. It's a beautiful place, and it's been now established, producing pretty well. And my buddy Steve Wigg, he also lives in Marcelin, Saskatchewan, so he's my kind of co-conspirator. He's the one who keeps me sane out there, and so I wanted to acknowledge him. And he's works in permaculture, so they implement a lot of permaculture processes there as well. And now that site is actually not just producing food for the community, but it's become kind of a major social gathering place as well, where people come to often for different events and ceremonies and things. So it's just another example of some of the work that's been happening. And that program's now been expanded to include a number of other communities as well. And in addition to just creating food, these programs, I've noticed, they have a lot of additional benefits. So we're talking, just basically job creation, employment, training opportunities, developing skills and capacity within these nations. Not everybody knows how to garden or do pruning on fruit trees and those kinds of things. And it also provided a venue for a lot of relationship building too, bringing people together in healthy, natural spaces to develop relationships. One thing I've heard in reserves lately is, 20 years ago, people used to walk around house to house, open doors, walk in, have tea, visit. That doesn't really happen anymore. And so trying to bring people, create opportunities for people to come together, get to know each other. And that community, that sense of community and the support that's provided through a community is critically important, I believe. And then also opportunities to enhance cultural identity, so doing some more traditional practices, having elders share traditional teachings, and even just a sense of self-esteem that comes from knowing that you can support your family, that you are growing food, you're hunting, whatever you're doing. It's very positive, a lot of positive impacts that all contribute, I think, to holistic wellness just beyond the food. Okay, Indigenous peoples and climate change. I really am trying to whip through. I think I've probably gone over already, so boss, I'll be quick. Indigenous peoples and climate change. Climate change, for me, is the biggest challenge we've ever encountered, bar none. The projections, and I work now for the Resilience Institute, and we provide support to small rural and Indigenous communities to help them create climate adaptation plans, do climate risk assessments, whatever it is they need us to do, we provide them with that. And so I do a lot of work with projections, and things aren't going to get better there. We're going to have more storms, more fires, more of all of those kinds of things. So this is something that's really important, as Indigenous people are still largely land-based people. We've noticed those changes, as I mentioned, even just in my own experience. So a couple of quick initiatives that are being led by Indigenous communities. First is the Bridge to Land, Water, Sky initiative. It's the first Indigenous-led Living Labs program in Canada. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Living Labs. It's one of the federal government's climate change initiatives, and they're They're working to find innovative solutions to agriculture that, best practices, I guess, that are going to keep carbon in the ground, so intercropping different cover crops. I don't know all of the details of it. But Mistawasis, Muskeg Lake, Redberry Lake, the Saskatchewan Aboriginal land technicians. There's a whole bunch of people that are involved in this and this is the only Indigenous-led program of its kind in Canada. And I think an important piece here is that they're making a conscientious effort to include and honor Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous people's, experience to help create some of these solutions. The other one I wanted to highlight for us before I turn things over to Bas here is just another project in Mistawasis that I was involved with, bringing Brother Buffalo home to Mistawasis. I know they're really bison, but that's the name that we chose for our project. We obtained 2 years of funding through the Indigenous-led Natural Climate Solutions Fund, and that's just to get us set up. That's just to get our buffalo management plan in place, provide some training to our band members. Mistawasis did have a herd of buffalo about 20 years ago, and they weren't well prepared for them and ended up having to sell them off, and so that's left a bit of a bad taste in people's mouths. We're trying to do things the right way this time. And I think the important thing with bison, there's a really amazing book I've referenced at the bottom there called The Ecological Buffalo by Wes Olson and his wife Joanne Janelle, who's a photographer. Buffalo are a keystone species, and so when you bring buffalo back on the land, the way they disrupt the soil, their patties that they leave, even the mucus and the snot. Man, Wes loves talking about buffalo snot and the ecological importance of that for healing the land. Brings back different plants, brings back different insects, brings back different birds, different mammals start coming, it heals the land. And healthy land stores more carbon than land that's constantly being, farmed or not taken care of. So yeah, these initiatives I appreciate because they sort of combine issues around food, issues around culture, and issues around climate, kind of all at the same time. And those are the kinds of projects I think we need to be looking at and keeping in mind that we're doing more than one thing at a time and finding those kind of ways to have multiple benefits. So just to finish up here, Miyo wîcêhtowin, that's the title of the presentation, and that means good relations. That's what that translates to, good relations, having good relationships. And so when we talk about reconciliation, we also often think of relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. But I think through these examples, I just want to highlight we need to remember from an Indigenous lens that the land is a relative too. Those plants and animals are all our relatives too, and we have obligations to take care of them and to treat them in respectful ways. So there's a Cree word called wîcêhtowin. Wîcêhtowin, it means to step over something. In this case, you're stepping over the natural laws, the guidelines that Creator gave us on how to behave as a good relative to all of our relatives, not just to our family, but to the land, the plants, the animals, the water, the air, the earth. And so I just wanted to leave you with that today. There's the references if anybody was interested. I did want to cite those things, and I'm talking about some serious things and wanted to share where I got some of that information from. Let people take a couple more quick pictures here. And I think this will all be online. This is being posted online after, I believe, so, okay. Okay, I'm going to switch it up. Sorry for those who are still taking shots there. But so yeah, Nanaskaman, Palamayelo, Marcy, thank you very much for your attention and for your time today. Much appreciated. Look forward to talking with you.